Hello and welcome to Her Theology. My name is Cass and I am so glad you are with me today. And this is part 3 of a 4-part series looking into everything to do with assisted reproductive technology, infertility, surrogacy, which is today's episode, and the next episode which will be freezing your eggs. And so I had the pleasure of jumping into a conversation with Dr. Megan Best, who comes to us with a wealth of knowledge. She has over 30 years medical experience as a doctor in palliative care, a bioethicist, and also a researcher. And she is now an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame, Sydney, for bioethics. She is, like I said, graceful in her approach, but also bold in highlighting all the ethical dilemmas that surround surrogacy. And that's what we're focusing on for this episode today. I hope you stay along for this ride. It is a fantastic episode. I learned an awful lot. It is a topic I'm genuinely passionate about because I think there is so much to surrogacy that we are not aware of and don't consider. It may seem like all is well and good in it and it's for the right reasons, but actually when we start to unravel it, we start to see that it is commodifying women and children, and it has so many sides to it that are really unethical, and probably we should be really seriously considering whether surrogacy is an actual option available to us all. Now, if you are new to Her Theology, my name is Cass. Like I said before, Her Theology exists to empower women and the men out there that are listening to know where your faith and life collide. And so I address a bunch of tricky topics along with theological discussions as well, just to help grow you in your faith and ensure that you become bold in proclaiming the truth of the gospel throughout all areas of life. And so if you are new, follow along on Instagram to keep up to date with everything that's happening. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. That helps an awful lot and you can keep up to date. And otherwise, I hope that you enjoy this episode. All right. So I have Megan here with me today, and I have previously discussed fertility with Megan, and we've also discussed IVF and that whole process. So if you are someone that is in that journey or maybe know someone, I feel like that's something that impacts most of us. Take a pause maybe on this episode and go back to the other episodes just so you can get a bit of the foundation work that we've done, talking about the ethics around those things and reproductive rights and the whole healthcare system that surrounds that, and also pairing that with what scripture says about children, family, marriages, relationships, how that all works together. And so Megan is a wealth of knowledge. And so I would highly suggest, like I said, you pause on this episode and head back to the other 2 episodes if you haven't listened, because it all kind of works into each other to bring us to this conversation today on surrogacy. And let me just say, this is one of her books here, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. I have been chewing through this. It's big and it's meaty, but it is worth every single cent. She talks about everything in this book, from the moral status of the embryo through to contraception, abortion, and then into infertility, miscarriage and stillbirth, reproductive technologies, honestly, stem cells and even cloning. Like, Megan, you have gone through everything and I really admire the work you've done into this. It's a lot, and it's such a fantastic resource that I actually think all families should have, because your kids will grow up in a society and probably asking questions. Your friends and family will go through things. Maybe you'll go through things. And I just feel like it would be such a helpful resource to just have, to be able to help process these sort of topics that we're talking about and more. So this is one of Megan's works.
Thanks,
But Megan, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for promoting my book.
I really love it. I genuinely really love it. And I love the title, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. It just, that's exactly what it is. So yeah, I know I've had a few people on from Matthias Media recently, and they've just got some great, they've published some great books and supported some great Christians. So I'm really thankful for the work of Matthias Media as well. But Megan, let's get stuck in. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. Let's talk about surrogacy. Maybe you could just give us a quick understanding of what surrogacy is. I feel like most of our listeners might be familiar with the term, but just in case someone isn't familiar with what surrogacy is and what's involved in that process.
Okay. Well, a surrogate mother is a woman who agrees to carry a child through a pregnancy and bring it to birth on behalf of someone else. So the commissioning parents, the parents who want the baby, arrange for the surrogate to carry the pregnancy on their behalf, on the understanding that at the time of birth she will relinquish the child and transfer custody to the commissioning parents, because at the time of birth, the legal mother is the woman who gives birth. And then the commissioning parents will raise the child as the legal parents. They may or may not be the genetic parents. So you can categorize surrogacy in a number of ways. I think the first way to think about it is what we call commercial surrogacy. And in that situation, a woman is given a commission, a payment for carrying the child. And this is not legal in Australia at the moment, though a lot of people are trying to change the law. It tends to be done in developing countries, and women who are financially quite needy may be really, I think it would be fair to say they're exploited to undertake the risks of pregnancy for a financial reward, which we might not think is very great, but can make a big difference to them. There are a lot of unethical practices concerned with some of these agencies. For example, because we've already talked about IVF. Sometimes if you transfer an embryo, it may not develop fully to birth. So they might impregnate a number of women, and then if they don't want all the babies, they just abort them. So I think that commercial surrogacy has a lot of problems. There's also been issues where the baby has been found to have some sort of developmental disability, and the commissioning parent says, well, we don't want a disabled child, we only want a normal one, and refuse to take the child or tell the surrogate she has to have an abortion. So these are often in countries where there is a legal arrangement, so sometimes the surrogate may be forced to do things to which she's ethically opposed because of this legal arrangement. So I'm definitely not in favour of commercial surrogacy. But as I said, at the moment we don't have that in Australia. We have what's called altruistic surrogacy, where the woman can have her medical expenses reimbursed, but she's not given any financial reward for doing it. Okay. And there are laws against advertising for surrogates and things like that. So it tends to be, through relationships in Australia.
Do you think those laws will change at all, or is there people trying to change that at the moment, or we should be okay
probably the one group that most is pushing for this are gay couples who want
of course,
to have a genetically related child, so want a surrogate to carry a baby on their behalf.
That would make sense.
That's the context in which this seems to be most heavily pushed. But, we'll talk in a moment about what's happening in Hollywood. But I looked on the website of one Asian commercial surrogacy group, and the advertisements were basically, when you get pregnant, your belly swells, you're not as physically attractive, why would you want to go through this to have a baby? Maybe your partner won't find you so attractive. So we have surrogates. You don't have to go through all those things to have a baby. And it was really promoting the idea of that offload the work of pregnancy to another woman because it's not an attractive thing, which I think is a terrible attitude to promote. But there definitely are some women who don't want to take time off work to have a baby. So it is being marketed for that purpose. But I think the gay couples who want surrogacy in Australia would be happier, because there have also been problems with the government not giving passports to children born overseas to surrogates. Because they're not born in Australia, and then when they bring the child back, and if there are problems with getting a passport in the country of birth, you can have children caught between two countries. That's definitely happened. So there are a lot of legal complications. when Australia doesn't
Mm-hmm.
support commercial surrogacy, that even if someone goes overseas to get a child, there could still be some legal problems
Yeah.
to get
Okay.
the passport for the child. So there are lots of complications, and I think, but mainly I think there's a lot of unethical practices and exploitation of women in commercial surrogacy, and that's why I'm opposed to it.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
altruistic surrogacy, just say that the other two categories to think about is traditional surrogacy, where the surrogate is the child's genetic mother. So she's just impregnated with sperm and she carries the child who's her genetic child, but maybe the sperm of the commissioning father. And then
I
gestational
did not realize
surrogacy,
that was deemed.
which is more like IVF, where the genetic parents are the commissioning parents and an embryo is transferred, and she has no genetic relationship to the baby.
I didn't realize that a sperm donor implantate. I don't know how to say it. I feel like I'm going to say it in a crass
IUI,
way, but
intrauterine injection.
thank you. That's a much nicer way of saying what I was about to say. Anyway, I didn't realize that was deemed surrogacy. I had no idea. I just thought that would be,
Well,
yeah,
if the
I don't know.
woman, no, it's if the woman's
Yeah.
carrying the child on behalf of someone else. It's not. She's not planning to be the social mother. She's still carrying the
Oh, I
child on
see what you
behalf of
mean.
someone else, but
I
the
see. So
commissioning couple don't have an egg, so they're using her egg and maybe the father's
I
sperm.
get you. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood
It's
that.
all very
That's good
complicated.
clarity.
There are so
Thank you.
many ways you can have a baby nowadays.
It's really a mind
Mm.
maze, isn't it? It's incredible how desperate society is becoming to wanting all the things. Like when you said before about how women don't want to take time off work, I'm like, wait till you've got a kid, and you have to like. There's a lot of time that has to get taken off work. So it's just interesting how we want, like, the world will look at things and go, we want the best of everything. So we try and find ways to bridge the gaps to make it all happen.
There are a number of things at play,
That's what it
though,
feels like.
because it's not. I mean, one of the reasons people want these ART procedures is they delay childbearing. And so now we're seeing more women in their late 30s and 40s trying to access ART, and that's because, well, there's some interesting research being done on how few people in the community realise that fertility declines as early as it does. But
Yeah.
You could say that, women are delaying childbearing because they want to get their education, they want to establish their career, they want to be financially secure. So, they can provide a better home for a child, and increasingly women finding it difficult to find a father for their child, a male who is prepared to commit to a relationship and to being a father. And so they delay their childbearing, their fertility declines, and then they need these procedures if they want to have a genetically related child. But I was just thinking another solution would be to have better childcare arrangements, better maternity arrangements, so that women can have children at the time of their peak fertility and didn't feel this pressure to delay childbearing. And a lot of these problems would never evolve if perhaps we had a society that was more child-friendly.
And more supportive of mothers. I completely agree with you there. It does feel very much like, as a mum, there's a lot. It's a lot that is placed on us, and it's getting better, but there's definitely a bigger need for support. I would agree with you there. So
anyway, there are all the different
I
types of
want to ask
surrogacy.
this question. Yes, so that's good to clarify surrogacy and the different ways in which it can happen. I want to ask as well now a theological question. So we know what surrogacy is. I have heard Christians say surrogacy is a biblical thing. Mary was impregnated with Jesus and she was a surrogate. I've heard people use arguments like Hagar with Abraham and Sarah, where, it's Abraham's child, but but Hagar's having the baby, and Rachel and Leah with their slave women. And so
No, it's
I
not
don't know if you've
surrogate
heard that. I'm
because
sure you've heard
in
the
all those
argument.
cases, the woman raised the child.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that because I have heard people hammer down on that, and a lot of Christians don't know how to
Okay,
respond, I
they're not
should say.
equivalent
So
cases. The whole idea of the surrogate in today's terminology is that you're raising a child which you hand over at the time of birth to social parents, and that you're not involved in the raising of the child. The whole point of the surrogate
and
is
social.
that you're doing it on someone else's behalf.
And I think that's important language or jargon for people to understand that are listening. Social parents means you're raising your children. Is that correct?
Yes, you're the mum and dad at home. You're the legal parents.
Yeah. So you're not just and what's the term we use? Is just surrogate for you're just having them during the pregnancy and then handing them off, or is there a different term like something parenting? Would
There
it
is a
social
move
parenting?
against the terminology surrogacy, talking about gestational mothers. I think it is.
Okay, right. Okay. Yeah.
And there always is a new
Yeah.
term for someone gets upset by the old term, and then you have to have a new term. Yes,
Yeah.
but
We need to update
most
our
people
dictionary every
still
year.
talk about surrogacy.
Absolutely. And it's just good. I'm trying to clarify this because listeners, if you're listening, I've gotten into debates about this topic with people, and they throw, jargon and terminology sometimes to try and derail you because it can get quite emotional. And so it's just good to be aware of the arguments people will use. And like I said, the theological one I have heard. So it's good to
I
clarify.
think in
Now,
bioethics generally, there's a lot of playing with terminology to mislead people. But my own view is that any terminology that obscures the truth of what's being done should be avoided. But definitely sometimes euphemisms or misleading terminology is used to try and increase support for some procedures that may otherwise be less popular.
Yeah, great. What's the difference then between adoption and surrogacy? Could you flesh that out a little bit for us?
Well, I think the intention is probably where the biggest difference would be. So adoption is a situation where you have a child who is born and through the vicissitudes of life doesn't have parents to raise them. And so the act of adoption is to be willing to take over the care of a child. Usually a child, traditionally we think it's a child you're not genetically related to. You're going to raise that child out of the goodness of your heart because the child needs parents. With surrogacy, you are making an active decision to bring to birth a child who will not be raised by their genetic mother, their gestational mother, their birth mother. And the focus on adoption's more the needs of the child, the welfare of the child. The process of surrogacy tends to be, in the majority of cases, a project of the parents. This is the child that I want. And so it moves closer to the idea of manufacture. And that's one of the concerns about surrogacy. Are we seeing a child as sort of goods that can be commissioned and produced at the whim of the parents? And the concern that you have a maternal bond developing between the woman who carries the child and then the child who's born, and you break that bond when you take the child away from the surrogate. So yes, it's more, are you interested in the perspective of what's best for the child or what's best for the parents?
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, isn't it? What's the motivation behind it? So I guess there's a lot of avenues we can go down here, and maybe you, Megan, can tell me what you think is best. Either we go now and look at what's the process of surrogacy and what's the the ethical and health implications for women and children, or we could talk about it more from a societal first and talk about how the society is kind of changing our mindset around it.
Well,
What would you
I
like
can
to
talk about,
discuss first?
some of the moral concerns that people have about surrogacy,
Yeah.
even outside
Yep.
of the
Let's do that.
commercial setting. Surrogates tend to be younger than the commissioning parents, so there is still a concern about exploitation. Um, this idea of are we treating the child as a commodity to be bought and sold through the whole idea of commissioning a woman to carry a child on behalf of other parents. There, we know from donor offspring, the children who are born from donor eggs and donor sperm in IVF, that there is confusion in their biological heritage every time you add an extra parent to the mix. So for these children, they might have donor sperm, donor eggs. So they have genetic parents, they've got the gestational mother who carries the baby, and then they have the social parents who raise them. So we know that there are concerns on the part of the child as you have an increasing number of parents involved, though a lot of parents who use a surrogate don't tell their children, so they don't know about this. It's not on your birth certificate, so it's possible the child will never know. I know some families where there's been a surrogate mother involved, and they're very open about it, and they talk about tummy mummies being different from the
Okay.
social parents, and they. I'm not saying that a child will never feel loved and secure after being born through a surrogate, but you just need to think, well, we do know from the donor offspring that some of them are concerned about the number of parents they have. There's when the surrogate gives up the child she's carried for 9 months, she is breaking that maternal bond, and it can be very difficult. Some surrogates, when they get to the time of birth, feel they don't want to give up the child. Certainly some feminists say that it's not okay for the pain of some women, i.e. infertile women, to be addressed by creating pain in another, that is the surrogate mother who has to give up the
I
child
agree with that.
to whom she's bonded. There have been
Yeah.
some
Yep.
studies where the surrogate, who generally it's preferred if she has already established her own family before she's a surrogate for someone else. But there have been cases where a surrogate mother has given up, relinquished the child to the commissioning parents, and then her own children can have anxiety. And I guess the idea is, gee, she's given away the baby and I might be next. So there are lots of people in the mix, and I don't know how well we've understood how it affects all the different players. We tend to think about it being commissioning parents who are able to have the genetic child they desperately want through a surrogate, but there are other people who are caught up in this whole process who can be hurt as well.
Yep.
So
And
it's a
on
complicated
just
process. Also, the marriage between the surrogate and her partner when she's carrying a child for somebody else. There are lots of factors that should be considered.
there's just to speak into that, I've done a lot of research in the lead up to this, probably intentionally and unintentionally. I've been looking into this for over a year
Okay.
now, because as you start to unravel surrogacy, it's a mess, to be really honest with you. And that's coming from someone that's not a lecturer, I'm not a bioethicist. I'm not going to say this in the most nice and pretty ways, but I want people to understand this. When you start to unravel it, there has been a lot of marriages that have ended because men have this they've talked about it. There was an actual term for it. This jealousy of seeing their wife pregnant, knowing that it
It's
wasn't
a
them,
sexual
and it
jealousy,
does
yes.
something to the
It's a
relationship.
feeling that
Yes, yes,
they've been betrayed sexually, even though no physical act has occurred.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's been daughters of women, particularly in the States where it is you get paid to become a surrogate. And there are women, particularly army wives. A lot of army wives will become surrogates because their husbands are away and they go, well, my husband's away for the next 10, 12 months, so I'll have a baby in the meantime, earn us some extra cash. But the daughters are growing up and the sons, but the daughters in particular are going, my body is a commodity. I can make money off it. Well, where do you draw the line then? Like, why is it okay for you to have a baby and be paid for it? Why can't I just have sex and get paid for it? There's this gray line, and it's a horrible moral and ethical dilemma to raise girls in seeing and normalizing. That is not normal. It is not okay. Your body is not a commodity. Children are not a commodity. You have value and purpose, and so does that baby. And then for men to see that and go, well, we're kind of not needed. They can kind of figure out ways to do it without us. And, look, this woman's single and she's having all these babies and selling her body off for it. Men aren't needed. So there's these messages there. And then, like you said, the one that really hit me, I remember hearing an argument for and against surrogacy. It was a debate. And one woman just said, if you have a puppy in Australia, you can't take the puppy away from its mother for the first 6 weeks. Yet in the States, in China, in India, where there is such a thing as surrogacy tourism, where, it is just such a big business is surrogacy. You have women giving birth, their babies are stripped away from them, and like sometimes within hours, immediately. We know now in attachment theory. So I've studied and done a course in counselling, qualified counsellor, and attachment theory is a really serious thing. What happens in those first 5 years, but particularly what happens even in that first year is so important. The bonding that takes place, not to say you can't be having a typical life, and there are definitely healthy people that have had struggles growing up, but we know the importance of mothers bonding with their children. And when you strip that from a child, not to mention the long-term health and trauma implications for women, because you've also got to consider that mum now is going to have milk coming in. So she's going to go for the next 6 to 8 months through the whole hormonal process of her body recovering from pregnancy. So every time she looks down and her tummy's all flabby and still, big and bloated, she's remembering she had a little baby that she was feeling kicking there only a few hours ago, a few days ago, a few months ago, and she doesn't have it. There is something so significant in the weight of that, like for the woman, but also for the child. And in some of these, and maybe we could talk a little bit about this, surrogacy, when it comes to famous people having surrogacy and paying for people to have their babies, like whatever, it's a walk in the park. And then even in this surrogacy tourism, these children can sometimes, particularly in the tourism aspect where people go overseas, they do get stuck in the limbo place of the passport. And in China, there are actual recorded by the hundreds of thousands cases of children that have been taken from their gestational mother and then put into the care of these like nannies for the next, 2 to 6, 8, however long, many weeks, sometimes months, until they can get a passport and be sent back to the country where the parents have paid for this child. So there is just, when you start looking into it, it is just this unraveling of just all these issues. And like you said, it impacts everyone involved.
And
everyone.
It can be very nasty. I did a lot of research on commercial surrogacy in the past, and obviously there's no screening of the parents. And I read about a terrible case where known child molesters had commissioned a child.
That gives me
and
goosebumps.
I won't tell you the
disgusting.
details, just to say the child died very young in terrible circumstances.
And this is the reality. This is why we have to talk about this.
It can go very bad.
Yeah. And this is why we have to keep on coming back to the fact, and we talked about this in our last episodes, children are a gift from God. And when they're viewed that way, we value them and we protect them and we honor that gift and we love them. Because when they become a commodity, they lose value. When you can just easily purchase something, you tend to not value it, just as a general rule, right? So when you have the same approach and the same kind of, the same viewpoint of children, we lose value. And that's where people are like, I've purchased this, it's mine, and I can now do what I want to it.
Yes, I
And that is
think
not how
to
God
see
intended it.
pregnancy as a service instead of a relationship really
Yeah,
demeans motherhood. And to
it
reduce a woman
absolutely
to her
does.
reproductive functions is dehumanizing for the woman.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Um, what do you think? So I had a question here. Like surrogacy is becoming more and more famous now. So the Kardashians have had a lot of children
Have
via
they?
surrogacy. Cameron Diaz recently, at the age of 51, just welcomed another little kid via surrogacy. And then I have talked about, and you've talked about, reproductive tourism. So what should Christians actually think? Like, what's our biblical reasoning, and how do we push back on this narrative that women's bodies are a commodity?
Well, they're not a commodity, I think is what we want to say. Um,
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Look, I think we have covered a lot of this. The idea that we're begotten, not made. That production of children is not a manufacturing scenario. It's we beget our children through a loving relationship with our spouse. That the intent, even if the vicissitudes of life interfere sometimes, and children don't have the families that would help them to flourish to their maximum. We don't intend to beget children who are going to be raised without a family, and so if we see the role of sex within marriage as being to strengthen the relationship between husband and wife and to beget children which they will raise as a couple within the family settings, is the ideal that God intended. And so we should also intend that outcome, even if things beyond our control may intervene that may mean that it's not possible. And I think that in some of our views, it's defiance against God that He knows best, because if children are a gift, we then have to realize that we're not all given the same gifts, and that there may be times where God, for reasons we don't understand, withholds the gift of children, and that is really hard.
So
Infertility
hard.
is such a painful condition. I spent many years researching the area around beginning of life when I was writing my first book. And I spoke to a lot of people who'd been through the IVF process, and both people who had been given the blessing of a child and couples who hadn't. And I would always ask the couples who struggled with infertility, what advice would you give someone else in in this situation? And the most common thing they said was, it's okay to stop trying. And it's interesting, the Australian government some time ago would finance 6 cycles of IVF under Medicare. And then you'd have to pay for it all yourself after that. And that created, in a way, a natural end to IVF. People would try their 6 cycles, and then, the free cycles were up. Well, that's how long you try, and if you don't get pregnant in that time, you accept that this is not something for you. And I think while people appreciate the generosity of the government in in now giving them an unlimited number of cycles. In some way, it's made it harder because when do you stop? And these couples who'd been through it all said, don't think of it in terms of giving up, because, you know, that's a sense of failure. You need to think about the fact that you give it a trial just to see if it's going to work, but it's okay to stop trying. And some couples even said you should think before you start, how many cycles are you going to do, just so your life doesn't stay on hold year after year after year. And success rates, particularly as the woman gets older, aren't all that great. And, you know, look at the facts. If you don't get pregnant in the first 6 cycles, what are your chances going to be after that? And it's sad to stop, because you're not just giving up ART, you're giving up all your hopes and dreams for a family. And that's very hard. That's a huge loss to come to terms with. But it's something that keeps your life on while you are in the grips of infertility and infertility treatments. It's so hard to flourish in other areas of your life that it can be very hard to stop, but it can also be a relief in many ways. So it's good to think ahead. How long are we going to go down this path? And if it doesn't work, just realize this is not a door that God's going to open, and let's look at other ways to find fulfillment in our marriage.
And I love that in the last episode you talked about, well, what are some of the other avenues? And in Australia, like, there is such a need for foster. There is such a need for
huge need for fostering parents in Australia.
Huge. And there's a lot of legislation that's changed. So a lot of foster care now is with long-term intentions. So, you know, there are other options out there. But I agree with what you said. It's incredibly hard, and it's an all-consuming season of life when you're in the midst of it, and it can be hard to make those decisions when you're in the middle of it.
That's
so
right.
It's really good, like you said, to talk about it before you go in, so you've got some direction, because you can't, when you're in that emotional and hormonal, like, the hormones are going crazy because you're getting treatment. You know, you need to understand that you may not be as rational, you know, you may not be able to make those decisions. And that's okay. That's part of the process. But having those conversations and agreeing to that beforehand does help
agree
that
as a
down the
couple,
track.
because it's really, I've seen some scenarios where one of them wants to keep trying, the other one's saying, you know, the chances are so small it's going to work. It's costing us money. It's the emotional cost, the roller coaster of every month seeing if you're going to be pregnant or not. It's, you know, it's you can limit the pain if you make that have that conversation before you start and say, well, how long are we going to try? Because we have to, with all these interventions, you can't guarantee success.
Yeah. And I have to say, that was probably the best advice we got in our premarital counselling. Is our pastor sat down with us and said, if you can't have kids by yourselves, like genetically, not genetically, like naturally, then what are some of the avenues? And we had to really battle that out, because my husband had a different opinion and I was totally not for ever doing IVF. So we had to really get to that place of agreement before we even got married, because it was a big thing. And I'm really grateful now, knowing what I know, that he pushed that. I think that saved us a bit of heartache potentially down the track. Yeah, and I thought it's a really good thing for pastors and Christian leaders to think about and consider when you're counselling or talking through, or anyone really meeting a newly about to be married couple or a newlywed that are not necessarily trying yet for kids, to talk about that. Well, what are you two going to do, and have that conversation?
Yes, because so often in the church we just
problems.
assume that children will come, and
Absolutely.
It's, you know, it's in many of the wedding services, and we almost thank God for the blessing of children before we've even started trying. And I think
Yep.
those expectations that, of course, we're going to have children is one of the things that makes infertility so difficult.
Yeah, I agree. I guess maybe to kind of close us off with surrogacy, we've talked a lot about the ethical dilemmas and everything. I'm just curious, is there legal issues we need to worry about as well when it comes to surrogacy? Like, we've talked about the moral, ethical, and the health implications for women and children and those also surrounded. But is there legal ramifications we need to worry about? The reason why I ask is I remember hearing of a story only recently in America where a surrogate mum was legally bound to abort the baby because the couple that had paid for her to have the surrogacy pregnancy found out that the baby had a chance of defects. I'm not 100% sure what it was, but there was something wrong, and they said, we just need to abort. We want to try it again.
That's part of the commercial surrogacy scenario, where you have a contract. With altruistic surrogacy, you generally don't have a contract. It's commercial surrogacy.
Okay, so there's no legal
America
pressure like
is
that.
the Wild West of assisted reproduction.
Oh.
There's no national sort of regulation, so all sorts of things can happen there. But certainly in places where there is commercial surrogacy, there are contracts. It can be things like you're not allowed to smoke or drink alcohol, but also if the commissioning parents, for whatever reason, decide to discontinue that, the surrogate is obliged to have an abortion. Or, if she has twins and they only want one baby, that you'd have selective abortion and kill the child, one of the children, while in the womb, so that she only gives birth to one child. So the surrogate mother sort of loses all those rights of protecting her child when she enters into one of those contracts.
Okay. And that's not there, though, with the altruistic.
Altruistic.
How did you say it again? Sorry. Altruistic. That's not the case.
No, that's not what we have. Though, as I said, there are certainly legislative moves to introduce commercial surrogacy in Australia, because it's really hard to find a surrogate if you can't advertise for one. But even with altruistic surrogacy, the main legal event is when the child is born, that the custody of the child has to be arranged for the commissioning parents. There's a bit of a delay with that. Some people are concerned that, in a way, the baby is in a grey zone when the surrogate's handed over the child, but she's still the legal mother until all the paperwork goes through. But I haven't actually heard of there being sort of any problems that have occurred as a result of that. But that's certainly, I've heard that be an area of concern. I have been asked, are there any situations where you think it would be ethical for a Christian to use a surrogate?
I was just literally thinking that in my head, going, is there any reason why
I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, actually, and I did come up with one scenario that I came across, that this is a real story, where a woman went through the IVF process, and she and her husband had some embryos created with their own egg and sperm. And she had the first embryo implanted, brought the child to birth, but had a complicated delivery and needed to have her uterus removed because of trauma during the birth. So there she was happy to have more children. She had embryos, but she didn't have a womb anymore. And basically, her sister agreed to carry the embryos, to have them transferred to her uterus so she could bring them to birth. I think that scenario does overcome a lot of the ethical objections, in that it's the genetic parents are the ones who are raising the child. So you haven't broken that link. And because the sister carried the baby, she was able to maintain a relationship with the child, even though she was not the legal parent as the children grew. So I can see how, and you're giving those embryos a chance of life, which otherwise, it's possible they would have been allowed to die. So I can see that you could argue in that scenario that there would be reasons to go ahead with a surrogate, but it's a very unusual scenario. I think generally, even if there's nothing outright opposing it in the Bible, it's one of those things where you have to say, is it wise? Even if it's not wrong, is it wise? And I've heard of problems even in altruistic surrogacy where the surrogate mother, if she smokes and or spends time in a smoke-filled environment, the commissioning parents are saying, but this is our baby, we don't want you, we want you to behave the way we want you to behave during this period of gestation. And it's very complicated when someone else is carrying your child. But, I must say, when I hear about the Hollywood stars, having babies at 51, 61 through a surrogate, it just worries me because it makes people think, oh, well, I could have a baby when I'm 51. And we get back to this problem where women don't realise that their fertility is slipping away from them at a much younger age.
Yeah, it's a huge
They
thing.
don't always report it
And
a
also,
surrogate.
Well, no, they don't. They just all of a sudden have a baby. And you're like, well, you haven't been pregnant for the last 10 months, so I'm going to put 2 and 2 together here. But it is, it's, and I think as well, something they don't talk about is that I'm like, you're going to be an old mum. Like babies weren't made to have a mum that was in their 50s or 60s. That's not natural. I mean, I know the very rare you can, but like,
4-hourly feeds,
right? So thinking
aren't easy
age-wise,
at any age, but I can't imagine doing 4-hourly feeds in my
goodness no.
60s. My goodness.
No way. And just also thinking about when your child grows up and, when they're 20, you're 80.
You're going to be
Like,
80 at their
or
21st
like,
birthday party.
so they have a chance of being parentless at a very young age.
Absolutely.
That's really selfish. Sorry,
Well, this
it
gets
is.
back
So
to this thing that, God created us to be fertile in our 20s, a bit less so in our 30s.
Yep.
And then we're healthy enough and strong enough to raise our children. Once we start to break God's plan, all sorts of problems develop.
Yeah.
I think our Creator knew what he was doing.
Isn't that funny? I'm so glad we worship a God who actually knows what he's doing. Makes life so much easier. Well, thank you, Megan. I think we'll wrap this one up here, unless you wanted to add anything else on this topic. But
no, I think it's difficult because the desire for a child is a natural God-given desire, and it's having children is a good thing. And so when you're denied that good thing, it is very difficult. It's difficult to engage in these discussions where we're suggesting that we should close potential doors to our own child. It is very difficult, but I think it's necessary for us as Christians to think about these things very carefully.
Yeah, that's good. Well, hopefully, listeners, this has really helped you. I would suggest you share this episode with your friends and family, with your church, or on your social media platforms, because it's a topic that we need to talk about. And I think we stay away from talking about fertility, IVF, surrogacy, and everything because it is, like you said, Megan, very raw. It's emotional. It's hard if you're in that season. It doesn't mean we don't talk about it. I think we need to, if we can talk about it and normalize these discussions, it might take a lot of the shame and guilt away as well that some women feel. So, just creating a space where we can talk honestly and vulnerably, but also lovingly about this, I think is really important. And, as my listeners would know from Her Theology, I'm all about speaking the truth, even when it might be a little bit tricky. So let's keep that conversation going. If you need any help or support, there is so much support out there. Please reach out and I can point you in the right direction. And I'm sure Megan would have plenty of people I could get you in contact with if you needed counselling or just support to kind of tease this out if that's the season you find yourself in as well. So, but yeah, Megan, thank you so much. And I look forward to talking to you in the future, I'm sure. And I just thank you because our listeners are going to love this. I have no doubt about that. So thank you.